There's a what?
It's Ian. Right.
Yep.
Hi, Ian. How? Good to see you, mate.
See you.
Yung live, instead of live feed, ito. Feed mo
Okay,
ko.
so we go first, Dr. Chong, and then I'll go in this. Okay, from.
Di ba nagbabato sa amin live feed? Okay.
Swapping that there is there was a workshop in Penang.
Maganda sir, dito mo ipasok yung Diyan mo
So directly responding to your question, right?
Dito mo ipasok sa...
Then you ask.
Yes.
Oo, pasok kayo na siya.
Ito na lang.
Okay. Yan ko mo. Saan ba? Hindi, kailangan natin kasi yung split eh. Talagang diretso na sa sayo, wala na.
Wala na monitor.
Ang monitor nandito sa akin.
Hello, Mr. Chong.
Yes.
You didn't visit Tatay Digong. You didn't visit Tatay Digong.
Andun kasi si Robin at saka si Bro. Nakita mo yung picture si Harry with Bro Robin. Sabi ko parang ayoko yata sa mama.
May cut out. You may cut out pa. They're having breakfast with the...
Exactly. With the cardboard.
The cardboard.
Can you share? Okay.
I'd rather go to Vatican again.
Oh,
Sarap po na eh. Work from home talaga. Malaki kita pag work from home. So, si Ian goes first.
Kasi galing siya.
So we start big picture muna. Big picture, what is disinformation and how to protect it. And then I'll push you specifically country challenges and agency different. And we can talk about our own personal experiences. Like live as we speak, we're being trolled, right?
And then we open also to questions of the
Exactly.
We have all the way till what, 10:30?
No, yung panel ko is commercial. Sabi ko isa, we should just fire all the lawyers on constitution. Isa lang yung ano. And then ang next selector si Marites Pinto. Okay, Marites, as someone who wrote the whole book on the arbitration case.
And even alone, trash the UNGLOS.
Yeah, exactly. So I was playing people against each other. Ganun kagago yung ginawa ko kahapon. Like, you want fireworks, sir?
Parang mainit.
Pero maganda yung discussion kahapon. I think there's no echo.
Parang mainit. Hindi kasi sarili yung ano niya, yung size niya, hindi rin putol din.
Lara, nakabarong na ako eh. Parang mainit daw.
Oo, may nag-off.
Sayang naman eh, ang laki ng binayad. Tapos,
Siya nang basa.
yeah.
Mga Ilocano yata yung budget. Oo, yung mga start. Hindi pa nag-start eh. Off mo na yung aircon.
Si Yon lang pag
Hindi pa
nag-start
naman
na.
andun yung wala pang bisita. Ayun yun na.
Mr. Chong, can you next slides?
Sorry, you want me to go through the slides?
just for test, Ian, maybe I suppose.
Yeah, can you see? I'm going through them. Can you see the change? Can you
Yep,
see the
yep.
transition?
All
Okay.
good, all good.
Okay, very good.
We did something that was the Royal United Services, the Malign version. You know what? We did the volume with Royal United Services Institute sa UK, about Malign foreigners sa Southeast Asia case studies. Okay, let's go.
Shall we? Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our. Well, we're not on a TV show. I think this is the reflex in my mind. My goodness, it is not my podcast or TV show. We're back here in the conference. There was a slight change or reshuffling as far as this panel is concerned, but I think we have more than compensated to make sure that we have the most engaging and entertaining, and I'm very sure also very substantive discussion over the coming hour and a half. So we're going to dedicate around 30-40 minutes for the question and answer portion. So please hold your horses. In the meantime, let me go through each of our panelists who bring country-specific and even agency-specific experiences as far as the issue of the day. Malign foreign interference or influence operations, or some would call sharp power operations. The whole challenge of disinformation. This is something we want to discuss. So what I'm going to do for today is, because one of our guests is joining from overseas, my good friend Ian, Dr. Chong from National University of Singapore. Perhaps we'll start first with Ian, just in case we lose him later on. We want to make sure his slides go through to set the tone. Ian, are you there?
I'm here. I'm ready to go.
Fantastic. All right, so Dr. Chong, Associate Professor of Political Science from National University of Singapore, go ahead. Let's discuss.
Okay, so what I'll do, thank you, first of all, for being so accommodating and having me present online. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. So what I will be doing today is to talk about some of the bigger picture, broader narratives that I see, and then we can drill down into the agency and country-specific things that the other presenters will talk about. So I'm going to sort of give you a broad overview of what I see. Now, to begin, we know that information disorder is one of these things that are here to stay. There are state and non-state actors. Among the state actors, but by far not the only state actor, is the PRC. But they are a big player in this space. And one of the things that they are very interested in is, of course, areas where they have the territorial disputes. So this would include, of course, the South China Sea, Taiwan, the Diaoyu and Kaku Islands, so on and so forth. So, but that's among what the many issues that they are trying to push their narratives about. So we're going to look a little bit at what the narratives are. And if you want a sense of this, the China Index, the 2 rounds of this now put out by the Doublethink Lab in Taiwan, they're pretty good at laying out some of these things. So you might want to take a look. So there are 2 rounds. There's the 2022 round, there's a 2024 round, which was just released in 2025. Okay, so in terms of the broad narratives, what do we see? I think firstly, one of the things that we are confronting is this idea that international law as we know it, isn't international law. Yes, this does sound like doublethink, it sounds like double talk, but this rests on this sort of view that what we know as UNCLOS, well, it should apply, but maybe it doesn't. It creates doubt over how that particular body of law applies to the South China Sea. The other sort of big narrative that we have is that the United States is a manipulator of actors, in particular the Philippines, in the South China Sea. And relatedly, there's a sort of the other sort of narrative that comes out is that the Philippines, in conjunction with the United States, is a risk and danger to stability across Southeast Asia and in the South China Sea. There's also another, I think, pretty interesting narrative out there about how the region is dependent on the PRC economically. That's not entirely true. We'll go through and see why in a little bit, and then I'll talk a little bit very briefly about some thinking about responses. So in terms of law is not law, as many of you here will know, the PRC is party to UNCLOS. They've not only signed, but also ratified UNCLOS. And under UNCLOS, we know that the arbitral tribunal process, which the Philippines had started, looking at the Spratlys, right, that is permissible under Annex 7 of UNCLOS. But what we see that the PRC has done consistently is to claim that this process is illegitimate, that the arbitral tribunal has no jurisdiction, that the award, has no basis, right? I'm sure all of you are familiar with what for the purposes of time, I'm not going to go through that. But what this sort of effort does, the effort by the PRC does, is really to erode and confuse what UNCLOS is, where it applies, where it doesn't. And what's quite interesting is that this sort of loosening of international law means to say that for middle and smaller states that are sort of more reliant on international law to keep major powers in check, to sort of have clearer rules of the road, that becomes less dependable over time. What's also fairly interesting is that this effort to sow confusion and doubt in international law is not limited to UNCLOS. We see this is part of a broader PRC repertoire. So if you look at, say, the Sino-British Joint Declaration over Hong Kong, right, that's supposed to be a treaty, but Beijing has said that was a historical document with no contemporary relevance. If you look at the PRC-Ukraine Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, there's supposed to be a component there that talks about coordination in the event of a threat to security by either side. That's not been invoked. The PRC has not talked about it and has treated that treaty as if it doesn't exist. And of course, quite well known these days, because there's a big push from Beijing, is this claim that the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 2758 determines the status of Taiwan, when the text itself says nothing about it. And the text actually says it's about the restoration of the People's Republic of China to the United Nations. It's about the representation of the China seat. But all in all, what you see is an effort to push against the sort of common understanding, even what is written in the text, right? And so there's that loosening of international law. That's sort of one big narrative that we see coming out from the PRC. Another is this point about how the U.S. is a manipulator. Many of you have seen it. Beijing has talked about the U.S. trying to encircle, contain, and suppress it, and that it's using others as tools. It sometimes uses this sort of race-based claim that it's this sort of Western or Anglo-Saxon idea that's sort of pushing the rest down. There's also some of this, class-based, drawing on their sort of revolutionary and some of the anti-colonial sentiments that continue to exist, that really it's about the developed Western states trying to continue to suppress the global South, which is why you see the U.S. trying to manipulate actors in the South China Sea to play up the dispute that would otherwise be resolved. And that effort is really to try to isolate the U.S. and try to make it into a problem. The U.S. may be a problem in many ways, but still that effort is, I think, an attempt to sort of cut up different efforts at cooperation, at this idea that the U.S. is has been a sort of more or less stabilizing presence, right? And that perhaps tries to leave the try to get people in different states in the region to perhaps be more skeptical of long-standing modes of cooperation. Another sort of element that we see as I think, pretty big narrative is this idea that the Philippines is a risk and a danger. In fact, at IMSC just a couple of weeks ago, there's this we see this push, right, that efforts by the Philippines to stand up for its sovereignty, to stand up for its claims, is a situation where we could get conflict on the doorstep of ASEAN. The fact that the Philippines is cooperating with the U.S. in the north of the Philippines, that is again seen as the claim by Beijing is that it's a way to destabilize the entire region. And essentially what we're seeing here is an effort to sort of isolate the Philippines, I think, and potentially one of the outcomes would be a further split of ASEAN, regardless of whether it's language of centrality that the PRC is pushing. It's in line with its general approach of trying to isolate and target what it sees as its main sort of perhaps threats or areas where it finds most problematic, and to give the PRC a relative advantage to win over others and to try to break down some of that cooperation. The sort of last bit, which is actually where I have the slides, is what I think is perhaps most interesting, is this idea that those of us in, oh, it's not, hold on, my slide seems somewhat frozen. Let me try to get that moving. Okay. Oh, sorry. I did want to show you these slides, but one second, I think. I'm not sure if you're seeing it, but let me try to share it one more time. All right, so this, I hope you can see the, well, you're not seeing the presentation for some reason. But I guess you can see the slide. I'm not going to fiddle with it more because it'll just be a waste of time here. But what I will draw your attention to, if you look at this slide, there's a claim that that ASEAN and various South Asian states are dependent on the US on the PRC for their economies. It plays up this idea that the value of merchandise trade is very significant. And indeed, ASEAN is each other's largest trading partner, but the PRC does loom large. Now, okay, here we go. But the point here is that if you look at also the balance of trade, what's quite interesting is that for ASEAN, we actually have a big trade deficit with the PRC. So, that sort of, it says screen sharing is paused. This screen sharing doesn't seem to be working. Let me try that again.
No problem. Just in case, Ian, maybe you can share with us your slides and we can, yeah.
Can you see that?
But your explanation is fantastic. I mean, obviously, ASEAN is also the biggest export destination now for China. We just overtook EU and America, so we're actually very important for China. It doesn't cut one way only. Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm hoping you can see the slides now. But this point is that there's this talk about how we're dependent on the PRC on the economy. Yes, that in terms of the value of merchandise trade, that's true. But if you sort of look at the numbers, and all this is from ASEAN Stat, we see that we actually have a big trade deficit with the PRC. So in some respects, they are just as dependent on us. And if you look at the sources of FDI, yes, there's this claim that the PRC puts in a lot of money in investment, a lot of big shiny projects like railroads, ports, airports, and so on and so forth. But in terms of FDI, it actually isn't the leading one. It has other forms of financing, such as loans and so on and so forth. But we can, in ASEAN at least, we continue to look at the US, the EU, Japan as sort of major sources of investment. In fact, as a source of FDI, the PRC roughly is about the same as Korea. So in that sense, we aren't as dependent as well. But this sort of narrative that it's all about the PRC, our economies cannot survive without the PRC, is this narrative that's put out there, I think, quite strongly, and many people in the public and even officials buy into it. You can see also, if we split this down by country, most countries in Southeast Asia have a trade deficit with the PRC. There are exceptions. Myanmar by a little bit, Laos and Brunei largely because of fossil fuel exports. But basically everybody else, buys more from the PRC than we sell, and they sort of, as with the trade war, they also are a little bit more dependent on the PRC. That earlier we saw this was in terms of the percentage of goods. This plays out as well in terms of the value of goods. You can make a comparison with Northeast Asia. And those are all the slides I have. But what I wanted to sort of end off with is this idea that this sort of dependence, it's played up so much, and so many people believe it, but sometimes the numbers don't really match up. And we do really want to think about where we want to position ourselves. As the sort of last bit to my presentation, of course, when we look at these sorts of narratives, the sort of war for narratives, it's important to educate ourselves and our population and to inform in order to act. But we do have to keep certain, I think, questions up in mind. I mean, in terms of our responses. One is, what sort of world are we happy with? Because a world where there's more of this sort of disinformation going around, it's, harder for cooperation and sort of informed decision making to take place. You want to also ask what sort of assets you have to respond, and is there sort of, or what sort of points of leverage you have, or is for some, they think about perhaps giving up in this sort of narrative. Well, is that a preference? What are the costs and the risks to that? And as we think about responses, I also believe that it is important for us to consider the kinds of responses we can live with, because of course it's possible to pump in even more disinformation into the system. It's possible to pump in more sort of selective versions of the truth, but that basically creates a situation where there's overall distrust, where people are overall more confused. And is that a sort of end state that we are going to be happy and satisfied with as we are contesting over various narratives, as we seek to protect our own interests? Thank you for your indulgence. I've gone on for too long, and I apologize for the issues with the slides. Let me end there. Thank you.
No problem at all. Thank you very much, Ian, for really laying out that was the lay of the land, basically, when it comes to the concern with disinformation, or we'll talk more about the malign foreign interference when it comes to the issue of a rules-based international order. I think basically the implication of your economic dependency item was that, if you're too dependent on a certain country economically, maybe you don't want to mess up with that country, right? That's also part of the implication that sometimes is more articulated than not. So thanks to Ian, we kind of mapped out what are the big questions, right? One is to say whose rules, right? That this is really the Western world's rules. This is not really the global South rules. That this did not take into consideration post-colonial nations, interests, and therefore even UNCLOS or certain interpretation of UNCLOS or certain UNCLOS rulings by certain bodies is not necessarily reflective of the facts. The other one is obviously what I call strategic gaslighting, right? When countries like the Philippines, for instance, trying to stand up for their own rights, the next thing you know, they are the troublemakers, apparently, not actually smaller countries who are just trying to preserve their sovereign rights. And lastly, and this was very properly laid out, and I have been always emphasizing this argument that, hey, you don't want to mess up with China because you're going to basically commit economic harakiri, right? But in fact, the reality is really much more complicated than that. We are now actually the biggest export partner for China. So Ian fantastically laid out that lay of the land, but let me go to you, Tricia. Probably there's even a more ontological question, right? Like, what is disinformation? How is it different from misinformation? How is it different from legitimate competing meta-narratives, right? Because each country has a different narrative of itself, its place in the world. So what qualifies as disinformation? And importantly, of course, what qualifies as malign foreign interference? So it's not just like a certain power from the outside saying certain things. Sometimes they have actually domestic clients or proxies who are engaged in reinforcing that or adding legitimacy to that. And in worst cases, the clients could be the head of state of a certain country, right? So from your perspective, maybe not necessarily Malaysian perspective, but what is your read of this disinformation challenge in the context of a rules-based international order?
All right, thank you so much, Richard. And first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference, WPS, Jeffrey, and of course, Jay, who is an old PhD friend from many years ago, for inviting me here. So magandang umaga, kumustaka to everyone. And maybe before I get to that, if I am permitted to give a little bit of context before I answer that question. So first, I think this is actually, in my opinion, one of the most important panels of the entire conference, because we know that the control of the narrative is key. Ultimately, you've seen it, right, across elections around the world, US, Trump, Brexit, most recently Romania, Moldova. Whoever controls the narrative controls the outcome of a certain situation. I teach in University of Nottingham, Malaysia, and I often ask my students questions pertaining to US, China, and so on. And our students are a mix of Malaysian but also Southeast Asian students. They are pretty much split down the middle, and I would say actually quite overwhelmingly becoming anti-Western. And I'm going to come to that context. So what I'm going to do today is talk both about the Malaysian context and then broaden it out a little bit more to the disinformation space. So just to share that, like, based on the surveys, we know that 80% of Malaysia actually has very positive views of China. And the distinct marked jump was between 2022 and 2024. So between 2022 and 2024, Malaysians' favorability towards China jumped from 39% to 77%. That's huge. And what happened in between these 2 years? I would argue that a large proportion of this jump has to do with what happened in Gaza, dating from 7th of October 2023. So already Malaysia, being a majority Muslim country, has been very pro-Palestine for many, many years, not least due to our strongman Prime Minister, Dr. Mahathir of the past, and all Prime Ministers since have been supportive of that cause. But what 2023 did was to accelerate this sentiment against the US, against the West. And so that jump is huge. I mean, 39 to 77%. That's one. Second thing I want to share is that because of Malaysia's very unique demographics and the breakdown of our ethnicities, so we've got a majority Malay, Bumiputra, what we call Princess of the Soil population, but we also have a very large Chinese majority. So we've got about 25% Malaysian Chinese who are, maybe 3-4 generations down the line. I am a 4th generation Chinese myself. I am not the part of the population who can speak Chinese, therefore I don't identify with mainland, but a large number of the Chinese still have cultural affiliations, family ties with China. So that plays into a lot of the ways in which government makes decisions and dealing with domestic politics, I think, as someone alluded to. So just to tell you the distinction of this, among the Malay community, the favorability also jumped from 28 to 73%, but among the Chinese community, the favorability jumped from 67% to 90%. So you're talking about 9 in 10 Malaysian Chinese who are expressing extreme favorability towards China. I'll just give a quick example. During the COVID vaccine time, like during COVID, and this is where we start talking about misinformation and disinformation. Different communities of Malaysian populations were exposed to different messages. And I don't know how, this is profound because it means that what's happening in Malaysia is that different communities are actually being exposed to different language newspapers and therefore are receiving and responding differently to different narratives that are being put out. So in the COVID time, you could see that those who were more English-speaking, more Western, would be sending out messages that that are in favor of Pfizer and AstraZeneca, and actually say that Sinovac vaccine is little more than chicken soup put in your body. I mean, basically the efficacy is not very high. But if you were to talk to the Chinese-speaking Malaysian population, they would be sending out messages of, Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines are going to damage your body, it's mRNA, it's not proven, it's not trusted, make sure you go for the Sinovac vaccine. And so you've got different groups of the population rushing to get different kinds of vaccines, and that is a perfect example of how this conversation around the South China Sea is playing out in the same way. All right, so basically, you've got. Okay, so we come to this question. So now I answer your question. Sorry, it took so long. Basically, I think in short, misinformation would be information that happens to be shared, but without a negative intent, right? Whereas disinformation, there is intent behind it. There's intent to malign, influence, and there are also other categories that academics have started to talk about. So they distinguish disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. But I think for the purposes of this conference, we talk about misinformation and disinformation. Disinformation has the intention of spreading it to influence a certain population or a country. I have a lot more to say about the specific media influence of China, but I think I'll just say one more thing, and then maybe we can come back after this. So we do know, based on research, and Doublethink Lab is a great research organization, glad that was brought up by Dr. Chong. Doublethink Lab, based in Taiwan, has also done research in Malaysia, and it has shown that the Malaysian Chinese communities are a lot more susceptible to these Beijing origin narratives. So what's happening is that you will see that, of course, the Chinese embassy in Malaysia will be active, right? So they publish op-eds in the local newspapers. Press statements that are released from Beijing are also republished in local news. But the newspapers that carry it more and repeat the narratives more would be those within the Chinese-speaking media. And unfortunately, I'm not even privy to that because I don't speak Chinese, but this is what is informed to me. So these messages are repeated in a certain segment of the population, and this also holds true for the plethora of social media platforms, right? You name it, right? WeChat, TikTok. The most recent one is the Xiaohongshu, which is called Red Note. And I think I have this number here, actually. So in the Xiaohongshu, I think we've got like a majority of Malaysian Chinese are actually on that app already. And this app is more than just a social media app. It's also a purchasing app, and you can put out articles. So you can imagine that the situation is ripe for these kinds of messages to be disseminated. But I think at this point of the panel, I just wanted to share with you just how complex it is in Malaysia. And so the government, being aware that you've got a large percentage of the population, meaning Chinese Malaysians present, exposed to these levels of influence, are also, I believe, having to tread carefully because of this large population. By the way, Malaysia has one of the largest Chinese populations outside of China. So yes, we know the Chinese, spread their wings in search of business opportunities all across the world, but Malaysia happens to be a country in which we've got a very large majority of Chinese, which also plays to our own inter-ethnic tensions within the country, which I haven't even started talking about, but that's the background and context into why this is happening and how messages are being spread. And I can talk a lot more about the specifics of disinformation in my second contribution. Thank you. I'll stop for now.
No, definitely. I think we would want to also go through. I think I'll get back to Ian also later, because different countries, starting with Australia back in the day, specifically in the case of Taiwan, obviously Singapore, the Brits, they're coming with different kind of regulations, attempts to deal with this issue of disinformation and sharp power operations. Does Malaysia have any pre-existing or ongoing efforts to deal with this disinformation, especially in Chinese language media that pushes for a certain kind of narrative? Because from what you're saying is, those years that you mentioned, you had the Ukraine war, you had the debate over origins of the COVID-19, you have the debate over Gaza, right? So this was where complete new ecosystems of information were created. I also have friends from the Chinese Filipino community who would say, they have relatives who subscribe to this version, that, this is NATO expansion, that the Western vaccines are this, and that the COVID came from, some American military exercise. So we also have a version of that, or I've heard the version of that. But what I want to understand is that, is there an effort by the Malaysian government to deal with this within the parameters of your democracy?
So we had an Anti-Fake News Act that was enacted, but that was eventually rejected because on the grounds that it was actually more authoritarian than anything, meaning that it was going to be used as a piece of legislation to stifle dissent. And again, just in reference to our own domestic politics, we have an ethnic-based affirmative action policy that's favorable to the majority Malay Bumiputra community. And so there were fears that this act would be used to, not just stifle opposition against government, but also stifle the kinds of discussions in which we talk about whether or not affirmative action is fair, question certain things with regard to Malaysian public policy. So we don't have that at the moment. We seem to have moved on from the efforts to kind of tackle this. But again, it's quite delicate, right? Because once you start saying that something is a piece of fake news and disinformation, where else do you go? And we haven't even talked about the other hot potato issue, which is AI. So we do have a national AI office that's trying to think about regulation. But I think, as we all know, Southeast Asian nations don't have the powers to actually push the large media companies to do any form of regulation. I mean, the action is happening in the US. We are just merely recipients of what's happening also in the AI space. We do have a government website called sebenarnya.my, which in translation to English means the truth is, so like the truth is.my, and they try to debunk, I think, major things that are put out in the news, but it's impossible to fact check every single thing. I mean, I think throughout the panel, maybe Dr. Chong has some other ideas as well. I know Meta has even stopped its fact checking tool on Facebook, and I spoke to a friend who used to work in Meta, who works in OpenAI now, and there's all this conversation about tech, right? How do you regulate what you believe as fake in tech, because it may be artificial today, but it may become true tomorrow. So the speed at which things are happening, unfortunately, make policymakers have to play catch up. And the best thing, of course, right now is to ensure that you have a kind of like loose guidelines and frameworks, but to regulate it 100% may not be efficacious in the long run.
Right, we'll definitely get back to this issue more. I mean, my favorite is still folks at TikTok arguing in favor of freedom of expression, right? That was one of the most interesting events to me, making an appeal in behalf of basic rights of Americans to freedom of expression from, well, we can talk about TikTok for a long time, our own freedom of expression there. As the most or second most trolled person in this panel, Comrade Ariella, we can run the analytics later on, right? I think it's an interesting situation there. You have a much more, let's just say, raw personal experience, not only with disinformation, but purveyors of disinformation embodied in a certain gentleman or two. I think there was an interesting back and forth, if I can even call that, in a recent hearing in the Philippine Congress on this issue. Can you tell us from your own experience, as someone who's at the forefront of the Transparency Initiative, shedding light on the facts of the matter in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea, and as someone who's been really a target of whether these are farmers, right, or character assassins, what is your experience and what is your understanding of how serious is this information challenge?
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everyone. Before I respond to your question, I think it's important for me to mention that the greatest challenge about disinformation that we're countering right now, it is the story of the People's Republic of China that they try to sell to the world. That is, they have the legitimate claim and that they have indisputable sovereignty over the entire waters of South China Sea. I think that is the greatest lie that we all have to counter right now. And this is not just a fight that the Philippines has to lead. All of ASEAN countries, we definitely know that this is a lie, whether you're Indonesian, Malaysian, Brunei, Vietnamese. All of us understand that with regard to the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea and all international law that the People's Republic of China have signed, they are violating this, and that the lies and disinformation about their claim is tremendous and outrightly ridiculous. For the People's Republic of China, such a lie is not something new. The only reason why they are very successful right now, it's because they have the economic and military power to dictate to their immediate neighbor, particularly the Southeast Asian countries, that if you're not going to cooperate with me, as what our first panel mentioned, they can use economic coercion. They can even threaten us because of their military power. This is the reason why Southeast Asian countries sometimes tend to ignore their incursion, illegal encroachment of their China Coast Guard vessel. With regard to the Philippine government, we don't consider this as a freedom of navigation, but rather violation of UNCLOS, disrespecting our own sovereign rights. This has been the position of our president, saying that all of this will never be tolerated under this government. As what has he delivered during his Assumption speech, we are not going to surrender a square inch of our territory to any foreign power. But despite of all this, standing up of the Philippine government in exposing Chinese aggression, there are some Southeast Asians who interpret this kind of action of the Philippine government as something that is escalatory or provocative. You know, before the Philippine government started the transparency initiative under President Bongbong Marcos, Southeast Asian countries are always left with two choices. Either we ignore the Chinese violation of our own exclusive economic zone, or we respond to it. But as I said, because of the economic coercion and our threatened national security because of their military power, responding to it is something that is very unlikely for all of us to choose. The Transparency Initiative is actually the third option that we're selling to you now. It is not that we are ignoring the violation of the Chinese in our own exclusive economic zone. Neither we are not responding because we choose to escalate the tension. For the Philippine government, exposing Chinese aggression in the West Philippine Sea is to allow the world and the like-minded states to understand that in this part of the world, there is this country, like the People's Republic of China, who doesn't care about international law, who jeopardize our peace and security in our region. And this is the reason why we choose to expose. Otherwise, if we just keep on becoming silent about it, if we're going to be cowed because of their bullying and continuously be victimized of such aggression, their lies will eventually become the truthful narrative. And this is the reason why we're standing up against them. But despite of all these efforts, it's still very difficult for us because the Chinese government, even if they're not going to contract trolls or any troll farms or whatever, the Chinese government never hesitate to express any statement that is coming up of pure lies. Just like, for example, the other day, the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources are conducting a legitimate marine scientific research, and the China Coast Guard deployed 2 Coast Guard vessels that are obviously bigger than our BFAR vessels and did water cannoning and even side sweeping of our vessel. We released a statement yesterday. It was supported by our like-minded partners, friends, and allies. This morning, the Chinese Global Times issued a statement saying it is the Philippine government that violated their indisputable sovereignty, that it is the BFAR vessel, the fishery vessels, that provoked the China Coast Guard vessels. Common sense will dictate that these are pure lies. And this is the challenge among all of us now that we have to face. It is not just ordinary trolls or different mediums that they're using, but rather it is a state actor themselves who are giving these lies, and we need to keep on informing the world what is really happening. Thank you.
Well, no wonder you're clearly going to be the #1 most trolled in the next coming hours after that very passionate intervention. Let's talk about malign foreign interference from a National Security Council perspective, Jonathan, because I think in the run-up to the elections in the Philippines, we just finished the other week, there were a couple of very high-profile apprehensions, arrests of individuals allegedly engaging in malign foreign interference or working with foreign agents who have been engaging in malign foreign interference. How serious is this problem? And I think that this would be perfect for us to get also back to Ian later on, also from his perspective in Singapore and more broadly. What should we also do in terms of effectively dealing with this? Are we equipped to deal with the evolution in this malign foreign interference challenge to the Philippines?
Thank you, Richard. Good morning to everybody. Well, the Philippines is facing significant threats from the PRC, as mentioned, not only in the ground itself, because of the battle for narratives, because of incidents at sea, which are termed as provocative by the PRC, and therefore we need to respond vigorously because, as mentioned, a lie repeated 1,000 times becomes the truth. So the Philippine government has this measured transparency policy. But beyond the area of, the information space, there's also this battle that's happening in the field. And that includes vigorous espionage activities by the PRC through United Front work activities. and also through espionage activities in the Philippines. We have made several arrests. In fact, these arrests were done by our law enforcement agencies over the past several months. Arrests made in Palawan, where the Coast Guard and the Navy maintains bases, and we discovered that there were Chinese agents who were doing surveillance, and we made those arrests. We also made arrests in Manila, Dumaguete, and many parts, even in Subic, in Grande Island, where we found that there were alleged Chinese tourists who were acting as agents of the Chinese government. So the challenge for the Philippines does not also is not only in that respect, but it also goes into, for example, the drones. No, submarine drones were found by our fishermen, and they were transferred to the Philippine government. And forensic examination showed that at least one of these drones were actually transmitting to mainland China. So these are not, these are not simply battles now on the information space. These are actual incidents that we have encountered. And as a result, 3 of our citizens who were merely in Hainan Island, on the invitation of Chinese government, as students, because they already finished their, as a result of the sisterhood agreement we had with the Palawan and Hainan province, as a result of that, once they finished their studies, they were invited to work there. They have now been arrested by the Chinese government because allegedly they were conducting espionage. But even if the journalists in this room, if you do your own research to the background of these 3, they have no military training. They're simply students. They're overseas Filipino workers who are only looking for jobs in Hainan, and then they're suddenly facing prosecution for espionage. So it really has become a significant threat, national security-wise, to the Philippine government, and it's important for us to be vigorously address this problem. Unfortunately, our legal framework is deficient. Our espionage laws are outdated. They're way back before, they were passed way back before World War II, during the time when we were a U.S. Commonwealth. And we don't have a foreign espionage, we don't have a foreign interference law. So it is the priority of the National Security Council to have that. I note that Singapore has one, the Foreign Interference Countermeasures Act, which they passed in 2021. Australia also has similar legislation, and many countries are now talking about passing this type of legislation, and we hope that the next Congress makes that a priority. It is also important for the Philippines, I think, to pass some sort of disinformation and misinformation law. But of course, such laws are always big debates, because the line between freedom of speech and disinformation, misinformation is very thin. So I'm sure this will be a very debated piece of legislation. But insofar as the National Security Council is concerned, it's important for us to update our foreign espionage laws and enact our own Foreign Malign Influence or Interference Act.
Well, definitely a big part of sharp power, and to put it, pithily, is weaponization of existing freedoms in democracy against themselves, right? To undermine their interests. I'll go one more short round just to build on this before we open up to question and answer. Ian, the Singaporean model was raised a while ago in terms of countering disinformation. Obviously, there have been numerous reports from Washington Post and New York Times about the Chinese language in Singapore allegedly towing the line from China. There are business interests also involved there. It looks like it's a big market for a lot of publishers in Singapore. But beyond Singapore, are there, do you think, viable models, let's say by dynamic democracies, but like Taiwan, for instance, at the very front line, or Australia, which was among the first countries to really shed light on this concern, that could serve as perhaps, if not a blueprint, an inspiration for democracies or semi-democracies in our part of the world? I'm being very diplomatic about this. Ian, what is your comparative analysis beyond also the Singaporean model on this front?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. I think the Taiwan and Australian models are worth looking at. Of course, a lot of these laws are subject to a lot of debate, as they should be. They should be subject to scrutiny. But I think the big commonality between the Australian and the Taiwan approach is an emphasis on transparency. Now, this is a element of the Singapore, this is the Foreign Interference Countermeasures Act that I've been a critic of openly, because I think that we're a bit short on the transparency front. So I'd separate malign foreign interference from espionage. I think espionage is a bit of a different case, but I'll just talk about malign foreign interference, which involves things, in my view, it involves sort of circumventing your regular and acceptable political processes, where we end up seeing certain voices get suppressed, other voices getting elevated or amplified, and it's not necessarily in public. A lot of it has to do with lobbying. So some of the politically sensitive persons registered in Singapore are people who are big business people. They have big business concerns. So they end up sitting on lots of boards where you have many politically influential people there, and there's a sort of back channel access that's not publicly open. Now, so where I think the transparency needs to go is, if you look at lobbying, there needs to be proper lobbying regulation. For senior officials and political appointees, they, I think, should be reporting, their lobbying contact. That should be a matter of public knowledge. Who are registered lobbyists, that should be a matter of public knowledge. The frequency of contact, that should be a matter of public knowledge. Those would be in the Australian legislation in particular, not so much in the Singaporean one. Of course, then there's also issues of transparency with the people who are in politically influential positions, right? In the Singapore legislation, it looks at the persons directly, but we know that benefits can be channeled to people's close family members. So I think there should be transparency on the assets and income, transparency not just to the state, but these should be publicly declared. That's something that the sunshine laws in Taiwan are quite good at doing. So we can track whether there have been certain changes and things like that. Yes, of course, people will think there are ways to hide and go around. Sure, they are, but it's about raising the cost and raising the difficulty of trying to do that influence. Of course, people should also be declaring for a little bit before they got to office and for a few years after they got to office, so that we can track whether the deferred benefits, right? That's one thing. Another element of deferred benefits that get to the malign kinds of influence, but also irregular kinds of lobbying, would be people getting hired into very lucrative positions right after they leave office. They bring with them, obviously, sensitive information, knowledge of things that they regulated. So there should be, I think, a cooling off period for people working for certain entities, especially foreign entities. Certainly not in areas where they formally regulated. There should be a cooling off period for senior officials there. That's not in the Singapore law, but that's not rocket science. It's out there. So these are some of the elements that I think would go into the law. I think the other things about the disinformation, yes, trying to address that is a big issue. It's a big issue in Singapore because it's not just the social media platforms that we have. You have private chats that were big disseminators of disinformation. And it's not mis and disinformation. So there's the intentional bit and the unintentional bit. We saw this during COVID. We saw this at the start of the Ukraine war. So I think having proper trusted fact checking that is actually independent and seen to be independent is important. I think also more than that, public education, which is something that for many of us in Southeast Asia, we need to work on a little bit more. And that works with transparency. So with transparency, how do you make sense of the information your public needs to know? Yes, for officials who are not used to more public scrutiny, that would be uncomfortable. But to protect our systems, that needs to be, I think, in place, right? So just very quickly on the element of the media in Singapore, we get a lot of stuff from Malaysia. The ecosystem is very closely tied. Right. We also have media that is actually state-owned, but because of commercial and other concerns, they are running PRC or PRC-aligned kinds of messaging. There, I think more education would be, of course, useful. And I think the sort of last point on the sort of misinformation front is that, we also need to really, apart from the fact check, we really do need to push what our own state interests are, where people should be thinking. Because the big fear that I have is that if we have a major confrontation in the region, Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, all this stuff about playing on social cleavages, that will come up.
Right.
Whether it's going to be ethnic, whether it's going to be other divisions, because an effort to I guess, stall some political decision making would be to create lots of confusion, would be create a lot of social divisiveness. So a decision, say, to support, say, U.S. forces coming through, a stalling of that decision could be consequential. So if, say, U.S. forces are coming through Malaysian, Singapore, Indonesian waters in support of the Philippines. If our governments, because of domestic concerns, of division, stall that decision, the support coming to you will be slowed. Of course, this division in our societies will be, I think, very damaging. It will take a long time to pick up the pieces. We've all tried to work over our different divisions, for a long period of time. We've had varying degrees of success. But if they get torn apart, we'll have to all pick up the pieces again. So that's really what's at stake for everyone, to get this right, to get the addressing of malign interference and disinformation right. There is something at stake. It's not just that the Philippines is far away or Taiwan is far away, etc. These things do matter.
Definitely, thank you for that. Yeah, and I'll go in reverse order just for response on that. Again, going back to you, Jonathan, how do you draw that balance between basic democratic freedoms and at the same time coping with the degree of threat, evolving threat we're facing? I mean, a while ago, artificial intelligence was mentioned. We have cases of deepfake attacks against no less than the President of the Republic of the Philippines. There was one version that showed him as supposedly being a warmonger, telling the armed forces of the Philippines to prepare for a showdown in the West Philippines, South China Sea. Then another version that suggests he's using illegal drugs. Of course, some of the deepfakes were more cheap fakes. They were like so ridiculous and badly done. It takes a certain level of intelligence to absorb that, but it's just going to get better, right? To research about DeepSeek, and of course this issue of I think someone is really not liking this conversation. There's also this issue of algorithms, right? Me, my TikTok account is sometimes it's 1 million views, sometimes it's like 0 views, and sometimes it's mute, right? And you're like, I wonder what's going on here. I don't think I'm such a bad content creator, right? I mean, Connor Tariela knows my skill set when it comes to provocative. So how do you think we can do that? Because I can see where Ian is coming from. Ian's concern, and it was also mentioned a while ago by Tricia, is this could also be weaponized by the wrong governments to amplify or in certain cases to actually to suppress certain points of view that they may not like for political. So how do we make sure we do that? And also in terms of education, right? There are also efforts, for instance, to make West Philippine Sea facts much more fundamental to understanding of our children, for instance.
Yes,
right?
that's right. Well, I hope I have the answers, Richard. Your questions are really thought-provoking and they're very difficult to answer, especially in the social media age. You mentioned about Filipino children, about how they appreciate the context and the facts of the West Philippine Sea. We're doing something about that right now. We've been in discussion and we've started workshops with the Department of Education because we reviewed the textbooks in grade 4, 7, 9, 11, and 12, and we found a lot of errors insofar as the West Philippine Sea content is concerned. And the Department of Education understands this, because the textbooks are produced by private publishers. In the Philippines, textbooks are not produced by the government. They're produced by private publishers because the textbooks have been decentralized or deregulated because of a National Book Industry Development Act. So we're working now with the Department of Education to fix those errors because the narrative is not really aligned with the Philippine government narrative, and there are some factual errors there. So I think the most that we can do, because I don't want to go into this because it's really very difficult to regulate social media. I think what's important is, based on our experience in countering foreign malign influence for the past 3 years now. We've been working on this 3 years now, and we have a wealth of experience. Based on my experience, number one is to, if you can pre-bunk, and or immediately debunk. If you can control, if you can be the first one to come up with a statement, because media always gives a lot of space to the first one that comes out. So you have to be the first to set the record straight on what the facts are, based on my experience. Number two, use the media as your ally. Now, we've done that in the Philippines. We have allowed the media to join our missions to the West Philippine Sea, so that it doesn't just become a government versus government battle. We welcome journalists from all over the world to come to the Philippines, and whenever there's an opportunity for us to board you in our vessels, we allow you to do so, because we understand that you're also out for the truth. So once we allow the foreign media and the domestic media to join in our missions, they become our allies now in fighting for the truth. And number three, things like having coordinated messaging among different government offices, for example. No, I think it is very important that for governments, no, to have a clear position, because sometimes if different government agencies have different thoughts about how to respond to certain incidents, it doesn't help the deterrence potential of that specific government. So as much as possible, under the rubric of the National Task Force West Philippine Sea, we try as much as possible to have joint press conferences where different government agencies are there, so that it becomes a whole of government approach. So that's the most that I think I can share insofar as fighting disinformation and misinformation. But you made a very good point, and our friends from Singapore also made a very good point about the use of artificial intelligence. We're now seeing that. No, we're now seeing that the use of bots and artificial intelligence really exponentially increases the ability of a certain narrative to have a viral-like condition. No? So those are the things that I think we in government have to think about moving forward, how to address.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Well, I think one of the things we tend to see nowadays is like this emoji invasion, right? Like someone gives a speech and then there are like all of these thousands of angry laughter emojis. I mean, you can troll anyone with that, right? And that's just a cheap troll farm operation. It's just totally AI operated. You no longer even need comments and all of that and make any effort against it. Sorry, Jonathan, for putting you on the line here, because you have a background in the education ministry, in the interior ministry, and now National Security Council. So don't blame me if I'm throwing all of this question at you. Commodore Tariela, going back to you. Going back to you. What is your understanding of a whole of nation approach from your own experience? Yeah, there we go. We already have a victim number one. What is your experience of the Transparency Initiative in particular, and pre-bunking and debunking and responding? And honestly, for me, I'm a stoic person, right? You also have to develop your own threshold of immunity, personal immunity. You just have to accept it's part of the game. The more you speak the truth, the more you're going to get trolled, and at some point you have to get used to that, right? I mean, what is your experience? What is a more optimal whole-of-nation approach, while at the same time, at the individual level, how can you be your best version fighting for transparency and facts?
Well, Richard, I think it's important for us to understand that, President Marcos has inherited a nation wherein there is a very limited information about the West Philippine Sea. From 2016 to 2022, during the previous administration, there were only 3 incidents that were publicized. The first one was the FB Jimber incident, wherein the Filipino fishermen went to the media and told everybody that they were intentionally rammed and left to die by the Chinese Maritime militia. The second one was when the Philippine Coast Guard released images of the swarming of Chinese Maritime militia in Julian Felipe Reef. And as far as you can recall, Richard, your good friend, the former spokesperson, Attorney Harry Roque, downplayed that incident, saying that
Bro Harry.
we don't have to worry about it because Julian Felipe Reef or Whitsun Reef is outside our own exclusive economic zone. But in reality, Whitsun Reef or Julian Felipe Reef is only 105 nautical miles off the coast of Rizal, Palawan. And then the third incident was November of 2021, when Secretary Lorenzana was the one who criticized and condemned Chinese water cannoning of the resupply operation of the Armed Forces of the Philippines then. And because of those limited information about the West Philippine Sea, and you also have the government who tends to downplay the incidents about the West Philippine Sea and even claiming that he already talked to Xi Jinping, that's why Filipino fishermen can already go in Bajo de Masinloc and fish freely. All of this are actually the reason why it was very difficult during the first few days of President Marcos to unify our country in standing for him for our fight in the West Philippine Sea. This is the reason why the Transparency Initiative was born and was conceptualized under the leadership, of course, the chairman of NTF-WPS, General Eduardo Año. We believe that the only way that we can able to awaken the sense of patriotism of the Filipino people is when you provide them the right information. They can never understand what is happening in the West Philippine Sea if they do not know what is happening, if they do not have the slightest idea about what we're fighting and why we are fighting for it. This is our approach in coming up with a whole of nation approach. As of this time, based on the recent survey, 89% of Filipinos now are supportive of our fight in the West Philippine Sea. The same thing with the international community. When we failed to leverage the arbitral award in 2016, a lot of our friends and allies thought that the Philippines are not really supportive of the rules-based order because we failed to leverage on the 2016 arbitral award. For President Marcos to be able to once again court the support and get the attention of the international community in our fight, we believe that the transparency efforts of the government also supported that. Nowadays, for the past 2 consecutive G7 summits, it has always been a constant issue now that the South China Sea condemning Chinese government with regard to their aggressive actions in the entire South China Sea. So our approach is not just whole nation. I think the transparency has already evolved, and it's not just targeting the domestic audience of the Filipino people for us to have a united stand, but it also encouraged the international community to be aware of what's happening and for us to get their support.
Thank you for that. I mean, since you're from Malaysia, and Malaysia is the ASEAN chair, again, no pressure on you. We had another Malaysian participant yesterday trying to explain why we cannot promise you the sky and the heavens and all. But having said that, could there be a regional approach to this? Because so far, Transparency Initiative is a Filipino thing and being clapped by basically the West and Japan and a few other. I mean, can we have an ASEAN Transparency Initiative? And we keep on mentioning, like in the case of the Philippines, we're lucky we have a president that at least when it comes to foreign policy, last time I checked, he knows his stuff. But what if we get another interesting president like the one that is in detention center in ICC right now, right? So how do we institutionalize this approach to mitigating, if not effectively combating, the kinds of destructive disinformations that fundamentally undermine a rules-based order, particularly on the maritime security front? Sorry for really putting that on you, but that's how much we expect from you in terms of...
Sure, why not? So I have 3 points to make. And before I make those 3 points, I just want to respond to something I think that Ian was saying earlier, and also in response to your question. He alluded to a future scenario in which the Philippines is isolated from Southeast Asia and from ASEAN. And that is a scenario that is very grave, and that is a scenario that none of the Southeast Asian nations should want to see. In fact, we should do everything possible to avoid such a situation from emerging. My first point was to again go back to research. So the Freedom House published something called the Beijing Global Media Influence Report in 2022, and it only covered 3 Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines, but all 3 were high on media influence efforts by CCP. So it's clear that Beijing does everything that it can to infiltrate Southeast Asian countries when it comes to putting out narratives in the media, social media, and so on. But for the indicator of resilience and response, Philippines and Indonesia was high, and Malaysia was only tolerable, meaning that there's a lot more that we could do. And what it measures is basically, exactly like Colonel, Lieutenant, how do I refer to you? Doctor was saying that responses need to be immediate, right? Responses, and not just from government. So what it measures is that it actually measures responses from the entire ecosystem: media, legal, government, civil society, academia. So that's really what you want to activate in terms of a rapid response system, so to speak. So my second point is specifically with regards to South China Sea. So ICES Singapore, which is linked to the National University of Singapore, comes out with this State of Southeast Asia report annually. And this year's State of Southeast Asia report showed that more than 50% of respondents ranked South China Sea aggressive behavior as the top geopolitical concern of Southeast Asians. So we are well aware of what's happening and the potential conflict there. You talked about an incident that just took place yesterday and the need to counter that. So yes, I know probably Malaysia is far down the list, but we also experience similar tactics. And what's of greatest concern to us would be oil and gas, right? So Petronas operates in the South China Sea, and it has emerged in the past that China has falsely claimed that our operations were within their waters, and our Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim responded to say that we would continue our oil and gas operations there. In Malaysia, for some reason, it wasn't as big of an issue as it could have been, or as it should have been, perhaps. So that's the second point, that we are also recipients to these sorts of tactics. But I suppose my final point, and this is where this is where it hits home, actually. While we are also part and parcel of these tactics from China, my third point is about the response. I can't speak on behalf of the Malaysian government. Of course, I don't work for them. But there's been several times this question about an ASEAN-wide transparency initiative. The organization I used to work for and head as CEO, called IDEAS, the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, we did a huge transparency initiative on the Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, we collaborated with one of the civil society organizations here, ADRI Strat-based, right? Yeah, so we looked at transparency of whether or not Chinese projects in the region were being transparent enough when it comes to procurement, when it comes to the development of the project. And we had great reports, and it obviously showed that Chinese companies were not being transparent enough. But what does it lead to, right? So it's great, the transparency is there. Does it put more pressure on China to become more transparent with their projects? We didn't actually see that happening. So I guess my question would be, even if there was a region-wide transparency initiative, is that going to change the aggressive behavior of China? I mean, I would love to hear your answers to that question. And what form of diplomacy is the most effective diplomacy that can achieve the outcomes that we're seeking, right? So I guess if you think about what the outcome is at the end, like that's why I asked the question yesterday, what is the end game that we're looking at? And I'm just going to say, again, drawing to our domestic politics in Malaysia and how the government responds to tension. The Malaysian government has always been, and no matter which coalition is in power, by the way, has always taken an approach of defusing tension. And this has got to do with our own internal inter-ethnic dynamics. Whenever there are infractions between ethnic communities in Malaysia, right? So, and those do happen, by the way, right? Malays, Chinese, and so on. The immediate way, the modus operandi that's taken by the Malaysian government, or indeed by Malaysian society, is to defuse the tension, because it has seen effects of the past in which tension was not diffused. Aggression begets aggression. So that is a fundamental philosophy that I believe, that I'm not apologizing for it. I'm just explaining that this comes from a psyche that historically has been inherited by the Malaysian society. So yeah, I suppose that would be the last question, right? Like how the modus operandi that's taken up and the kind of diplomatic means that are chosen, what presents itself as solutions or non-solutions for the outcomes. So
Right.
I'll end there for now.
Thank you for asking a question before the question and answer portion. Maybe quickly, Commodore Tariela, if you could respond to that before we get more angry emojis on Ian's screen.
A lot of people has been asking, like, for almost 2 years of the transparency initiative of the Philippine government, what has it brought us, right? People are asking,
There you go.
did it really change the behavior of the Chinese government? Or did it really increase the level of escalation and aggression because the Philippines decided to stand up, and by standing up, exposing the Chinese aggression? I always borrow the line of Justice Carpio. He said that our fight in the West Philippine Sea, and I think the same battle of Indonesia for Natuna against China, Locuna Shoal for Malaysia, Paracel and Vanguard for Vietnam, our fight against China with their illegal claim in the entire South China Sea is actually intergenerational. This is a long fight for all of us that we need to survive. If we're not going to expose the truth, if we're not going to tell the world that China is really blatantly violating international law, eventually, the next generation of your own people in your own country would eventually probably think it's probably much better not to stand up for our own rights. It's because it's, as others would claim, this is more peaceful and non-escalatory. And then I always argue that Southeast Asian countries have a very lengthy fight for your independence, sovereignty, and freedom. This is not the Southeast Asian that we know prior our own independence. We used to fight for what is right. We used to fight for our own freedom and independence. We just have to keep on fighting. Otherwise, China will definitely dominate the next generation of your own people. Here in the Philippines, President Bongbong Marcos never promised that our fight in the West Philippine Sea, by the time he steps down, will already be victorious. Our commitment to the Filipino people right now is just for us to hold the line for the next generations to continue the fight. Exposing Chinese aggression, creating awareness to the Filipino people, especially the younger ones, is the greatest output of the Transparency Initiative. This is something that you should also give to your own people. And this is the only impact that I can tell that is I'm really very proud of under this government.
Thank you for that, Senator, Commodore Tariela, for that. Where's the heart emoji? Where are the fireworks, Ian? You want to add something, Dr. Jonathan?
Yes, actually I was looking for his name in the ballot during the last election.
It's a bit too late for
Too late.
Maybe the next
in
one.
the next election, you have my vote, Senator Tariela. Let me just try to answer what Tricia's question about has the Transparency Initiative been effective in changing China's behavior? I think there's a misimpression among the general public that we implemented the Transparency Initiative because we wanted to change China's behavior. There was never such an objective on the part of the Philippine government because we are realists here. We understand that transparency alone will not be able to change. Our number one purpose in having the Transparency Initiative was really to galvanize public support for the Philippine public position. It was really domestic. The international result, while very effective, I think, was not really our primary objective. It was really the domestic. And the secondary advantage was we got the support of many nations. No, in fact, we're now signing defense cooperation agreements with countries such as Germany, right? New Zealand, in addition to our traditional partners like Australia, Japan, the United States. So really, one clear output of the initiative was the support coming from the G7 and like-minded nations, and the support coming from individuals from Malaysia, Singapore, all of these things, I think, individuals, if not the states themselves, because when the states talk to us informally, understand, they support us, and they just tell us that they cannot come out publicly because of domestic issues and international repercussions. But if the discussion is about changing Chinese behavior, there has been one instance when I can say that the Transparency Initiative had an effect of affecting Chinese behavior. That was the incident in the Rore mission in June of last year, wherein the Chinese Coast Guard utilized pickaxes, bolos, and there was a member of the Philippine Navy Special Warfare and Operations Group whose thumb or finger was detached. That was international news, and I was abroad at that time, and CNN broadcasted those images worldwide. And immediately, after ignoring our calls for a bilateral consultation mechanism, the Chinese government called, and they wanted a BCM meeting. We have it from A1 sources that the reputational damage to the Chinese government was so much that they want to move forward, and the result is the provisional understanding. So there are some results, but again, I'd like to clear the air that it was never really the intention of the Philippine government to change Chinese behavior. We understand, being students of public policy and international relations, that when you endeavor to change the behavior of another state, you have to use all the tools in your arsenal. And transparency in just one tool. It has to be in conjunction with diplomacy, deterrence, and many other instruments of national power.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Secretary, because the cabinet reshuffle is happening. Maybe there's a new opening for you. So I'm just going to go with the order by which actually I was worried people are asleep. So I think the emojis of Ian awakened too many people. Suddenly we have 10,000 questions out there. Let me start here. I saw Colin Ko and then Supriyanto. Sorry if my eyes are not strong enough. Yes, and then we're going to have Yakub, I think, went third. Can we go first with Colin? So we'll take 3 or 4 questions by each batch, and then we'll go back to the rest of folks. Colin?
Thank you, Richard. It's more of a comment, a rather personal one as well. And I welcome the panelists to respond and everyone here to correct me if I'm out of line. I'm going to be a little bit controversial here. Perhaps to deal with this, what I tend to see as an intergenerational problem when it comes to disinformation, misinformation, it's not going to go away very soon. And I will propose what I will roughly call a crowdsourcing approach, targeting people like myself, academics, think tankers, scholars, wherever you are. We are in a very strange situation where the public doesn't necessarily always trust what the government puts out. So that could be an issue. But I will suppose that some members of the public might pay some attention to reputable academics, think tankers, and at least give some premium to what they say, so that at least they can help to shape the public discourse. Now, what I'm trying to propose here and to very much make an appeal here is for academics, scholars, think tankers to make full use of their knowledge to help to counter disinformation on the relevant topics. Now, there is, of course, a thin line between being academic and advocate, and nobody wants to be seen to be a pundit of some sort, right? I understand that. But there is no need to take any stance that is against any country. All you need to do is you can be neutral, you can be fact-based, you can be as objective as possible. You don't even have to do it full-time. Some people think that I do full-time on Twitter and post things full-time on Twitter. I don't do that. I'm an academic, I have a day job. I publish papers, I teach a lot of courses, okay? So I do have a lot of things to do. But the thing is, when academics, think tankers decide that, okay, I shouldn't tweet against disinformation, I just need to publish. It takes an average of 6 months to publish a paper. And in the 6 months, many things could change, right? By the time 6 months, you publish your paper, the damage has been done. So my appeal is for all of you who are like me, academic, scholar, think tanker, please have to do your part. You don't have to do it full time. You don't have to be on Twitter every day, 24/7, all right? You have better things to do. And I just want to say that you will face repercussion. In my case, I've been trolled a number of times. People call me a Han Chinese traitor, Han Jian. Some even went further than that. They ask, oh, will your grandfather feel ashamed of you? Yeah, he died during Cultural Revolution. So do you see him before? You know, honestly. So you'll face that. But if you know you're doing the right thing, I will urge everyone who's like me, if you feel that you have the knowledge and you have the facts, please do your part. And I think if we have more of us doing that, gradually we might be able to shift the ground more towards the side of the right and the truth. Thank you so much.
I think we have another senatorial in the making. I was worried your solution was climate change. Let's just like sea levels will take care of all our problems in a generation. Thank you for that fantastic idea about epistemic communities maybe working together. I mean, well, Elon Musk is running 3 major companies and is on Twitter 24/7. So maybe it's doable. We can do it. Mr. Supriyanto, yes, please.
Thank you. Rustian Supriyanto from the University of Indonesia. I'd like to share perhaps a concern in the region that may also stem from disinformation tactics. That is, a lot of Chinese scholars and media talk about transparency initiative as nothing more than domestic expression of Filipino politics, right? So the transparency initiative may not outlast a single administration because as people know, Philippine and China relations, they go in peaks and troughs. It's like a roller coaster. But China, and especially President Xi Jinping, is here to stay. So perhaps there might be, there's a concern that future Filipino administrations might be less transparent. So what are you going to say to this disinformation?
So this is the institutionalization issue. Can we take, relax, I mean like, we still have maybe Ms. Guerrero first, and then we'll go to Mr. Yakub, and then I'll try to go back. Yeah. It's okay, we'll take another turn, don't worry. Yeah.
Good morning, sirs. I am Kat from StratBase. I just wanted to ask, since several investigations and data analytics revealed that the groups that perpetuate anti-West Philippine Sea narratives are actually the same groups that perpetuate pro-Duterte and anti-administration narratives as alluded to earlier in the panel discussion. I just wanted to ask, since we're coming off from elections last week and we saw 5 senator-elects that are Duterte allied, have you seen any increase in the disinformation campaigns following that? Thank you.
Thank you. And Yakub?
Thank you, Richard. Dr. Rahman Yaakob from Lowy Institute, Sydney. So last year when I talked to President Marcos, I asked him why was he assertive in his statement. So he explained that the Philippines need to convey the right information to other ASEAN countries. I think Commodore Jay mentioned about right information, but my questions will be on the effectiveness. How do you convey the right information effectively? And I think this is where the Chinese are winning over the Filipinos. For example, following up on Colin Coe's explanation just now, the Chinese universities, think tanks, and diplomats, they are heavily or actively engaging their counterparts in ASEAN. For example, one of our ASEAN officials told me he was briefed that whatever going on in the South China Sea is because of the Filipinos. The Filipinos initiate the aggressiveness. It's not the Chinese. Yeah. And of course, a friend of mine, a colleague based in a Southeast Asian country, every year he receives Chinese abalone from China. I'm not saying that Manila should give abalone to the researchers, but this is how the Chinese are trying to win over Southeast Asian researchers, think tanks, and beside abalone, a colleague also received flowers, chocolate, and wine. So this is their effort of winning the hearts and mind of Southeast Asian researchers. But throughout my research, I have identified a gap in the Philippines engagement. It seems that the Philippines universities, think tanks, are not actively engaging their Southeast Asian counterparts to convey the right information. So I think this is one area that you can look at. I put up a short recommendation paper for the Filipinos government actually last year. I can share it with you later on. Thank you.
Envelope diplomacy. Ian, you want to take the first crack at this? I see a lot of... Please.
Yeah, so it's really great to see lots of friends in the audience. Sorry, I can't be with you. Now, I think Colin's idea about using independent, sort of trusted voices is an important one. I also agree that the PRC has been very effective in using their own think tanks and universities and their outreach to their counterparts overseas to sort of push their view. It's something that in Southeast Asia we really haven't been doing very much. Now, in principle, I really like Colin's idea about having independent, trusted voices. But the thing is, we also have to think about how to protect and keep independent and trusted. That's where the challenge will be. Yes, there will be, I guess, on the more positive side, the sending of abalone and wine, but also academics and others who are more vocal sometimes will get targeted. Their employers will get complaints. You know, they could be also, I mean, apart from the online trolling, there could be in real life pressure as well. And also to maintain that independence, think tanks and individuals have to be even-handed, right? They have to call things out in a way that is informed by the evidence. And that means that at times, maybe people affiliated with or in their own governments may be called out. And that may be uncomfortable for the home government or the governments in question. So I guess here's the issue is, if you want to have independence and you want to have transparency, you know, it will cut both ways. And I suppose part of the cost of trying to address information disorder is to accept that sometimes if you get things wrong, even if you're in a position of authority, you will be called out. But overall, if everyone believes that there's that even-handedness, then it's more credible when a malign effort is being called out for being problematic. But I mean, I think, so basically I'm just adding on to Colin's point that we really do have to understand how the sort of broader ecosystem works. Thanks.
Jonathan, you want to talk about the think tank diplomacy also and all? Yeah.
Thank you. I completely agree with what Colin said. In the Philippines, we have a lot of academics who go on television, who write opinion ads, who do research on this, and we are very grateful for their help. No? Some of them are here. They help us fight for the truth, and I hope the academics in other countries will do the same. As to the question of our friend from Indonesia about the reality of Philippine domestic politics, yes, there's always a risk that the next administration will do a 100-degree turn. You know, as democracies, that's really the risk of democracies because we are bound by election cycles. The PRC has an advantage because it is a one-state party that controls and has this long-term goal. The Philippines, unfortunately, or fortunately, is a democracy. So the number one, the president dictates foreign policy. However, there's one way we can mitigate that by passing legislation. And we have done so. We have passed the Philippine Maritime Zones Act, which clearly delineates our sovereign rights in the exclusive economic zone and enshrines in our domestic legislation the entitlements that we got from the 2016 arbitral ruling. And that's law. No? And any president which wishes to undermine that is technically liable for impeachment. So we also passed the Archipelagic Sea Lanes Law to conform with UNCLOS. So policies such as this and public support, overwhelming public support, I think will be a compelling matter for the next administration, whoever they may be. So we just need to keep on putting into laws all of these entitlements so that future Philippine presidents will be constrained from changing the policies that we have already enshrined into law. I agree that we need to do more about engaging with our ASEAN partners. Philippine universities and think tanks have to step up, and even our government has to step up and engage with ASEAN more. We are just part of one region, and therefore people-to-people exchanges, forums, and activities such as this have to be more often, not only here in the Philippines, but also abroad, so that we can have a constant exchange of ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's not like we don't have enough of strong men from Saddam to Putin who have shown erraticness, even worse than us, crazy democracies. Comrade Tariela, any responses to tweeting 24/7 maybe?
I would like to, of course, say there's a good idea proposed by Colin. But I think Richard Haydarian is actually our best example of an academic think tank celebrity who stands up for the truth despite of the trolling by thousands trolls against him in standing firm for our fight in the West Philippine Sea. And I must agree with ADG Jonathan Malaya when he said that the National Security Council is also engaging scholars, particularly known professors who are really proficient when it comes to the international law, like Justice Carpio, Attorney J. Batong Bakal, to come up with this kind of dialogue and conferences that would educate the Filipino people. Regarding the comment about transparency initiative will only last until 2028, until such time that President Bongbong Marcos stepped down. The main objective of the transparency initiative is to make sure that the Filipino people are already aware of what we are fighting for. If 100 Filipinos from Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao are completely aware of what's happening in the West Philippine Sea, we want that the next presidential election, we have to make sure that West Philippine Sea should be the main reason why he's going to be elected. I won't agree that for those people who are saying that transparency will eventually end by 2028 because the next president will definitely change it. Well, that's the main objective why we're doing this. To make sure that the voters of the Philippines will ensure to elect a president who's going to continue our fight in the West Philippine Sea. This is the greatest objective of our efforts in the Transparency Initiative. The third one, for the pro-Duterte, pro-China trolls that you were mentioning. I thought ADG Jonathan Malaya will be answering this, but I realized it's just on my notes. That's why I have to respond to this. There are really clear evidence that those who are pro-Duterte against the government are also the same trolls who are also pro-China or undermining our own position in the West Philippine Sea. With regard to the senatorial candidates, I don't think that those candidates that were supported by Duterte will also be eventually our problem in our legislation or having an appropriation budget deliberation as an issue. I still believe that the Filipino people, as what they said, the voice of the people is the voice of God. The Filipino people has already decided, and those senators are now senator-elect, and we just have to, pray hard that they're going to be objective in ensuring that our fight in the West Philippine Sea is not actually dictated by their own party member, but rather it's for the interest of the Filipino people. The third one is how effective are we in reaching out to Southeast Asian countries? Since November, we have already came up with this Manila dialogue on the South China Sea. Right now, we have dams. This is one of our approach in reaching out to our ASEAN neighbors to talk about freely about South China Sea, so that we're not going to be victimized about great power competition. We are here talking to you as what was noted by Dr. Daniel in his opening speech, to make sure that all of Southeast Asian countries have their own agency, that we're not dictated by Western countries, that we're not being pressured by China. We talk about South China Sea issue here freely and independently and out of rationality. That is one of the best examples that I would say that this government is really serious in reaching out to Southeast Asian countries. You know, I would also like to share what are those concerns that would eventually compel Southeast Asian countries to condemn and criticize China with regard to the South China Sea concern. As everybody probably knows, I'm an avid user of Twitter or X, especially in exposing the incidents that are happening in the West Philippine Sea. Every time I post anything that concerns the resupply mission or in Ayungin before, the highest engagement that I can only have is somewhere between 450 to 500,000 engagements. But if I'm going to post something that is related to the harassment of the Filipino fishermen and to the damage of the marine environment, my highest engagement reached 1.3 million. And if you're going to look at the geolocations of those people who interacted on my resupply mission in Ayungin, these are our traditional allies, and very small dots came from Southeast Asia. But for the harassment of the fishermen and the damage to the marine environment, those dots are pretty much concentrated in Southeast Asia. I would like to believe that Southeast Asian countries look at the welfare of their own fishermen and worried also about the Chinese aggression. The same thing with the marine environment. If there are only two main concerns that will really unify the Southeast Asia in standing firm in the South China Sea, those are the two issues: ensuring the safety and security of their own fishermen and protecting the marine environment. That is the reason why we also need to engage our marine scientists, not just for the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, but across Southeast Asia. As it was highlighted yesterday, science diplomacy in the South China Sea is another avenue where we can have a cohesive stand in countering the unlawful and damaging activities of the People's Republic of China in the entire South China Sea.
Well said, Senator Commodore Terriella. I look forward to the day that I'm sitting beside the future, just really quick response. I won't get into, obviously, the Filipino politics. Just a response on countering disinformation. People in academia and think tanks and in the policy space need to be very, very worried about disinformation. What we trade in facts, we trade in evidence. And if facts and evidence no longer matter, then what happens to our professions, indeed? So I completely agree with the need to activate more academics, think tanks. In fact, I think this is something that our own Malaysian government can learn from. I'm so impressed by the Filipino representatives from the Coast Guard and National Security Council. I mean, we have, of course, ours as well, but I think being able to speak so explicitly about the concerns that are being faced, I think we could definitely do more of that, even domestically within Malaysia. To ensure that Malaysian citizens are completely, fully aware, right, of our own, what we're facing as well in the region. But I just have a quick story to share about, I was speaking in a big think tank international conference last year, and all this was coming out as well, how think tanks face and counter disinformation. One of the think tanks I met from Argentina, they set up an entire think tank full of economists. They left their university jobs just to have a think tank that would process economic facts and push it out to the media. So that's the extent of which we're facing this kind of disinformation, whether or not we're willing to leave our jobs and work in organizations just to push out information to the media. I'm not sure, but I think some of us are doing this in multiple hats and multiple roles. But the final thing would be, where are the resources to pump in to such initiatives? So the resources also need to be region-wide in order to ensure these messages are being spread. And I think conferences like these are perfect examples of what we can do more collectively as a region. Thank you.
Well, I mean, if you have 120% inflation and President Milei, I would also do the same as our Argentinian friends. We're practically out of time, so I'm just going to go very quickly with people by the order I saw them popping up. So, Mr. Hoyin, and then Patrick, and then Prashant, then Justin. I don't know if I can squeeze in one more. Can we go in that order first? Yeah, please first.
Yeah, thank you. I have two questions for the panelists. The first one is that officially, is there any plan or strategy from the Philippines government to reconceptualize or to update the transparency initiative, perhaps with new substance or initiative to include other regional stakeholders? Because it seems to me that the China aggressive activities in the South China Sea have persisted. And on the other hand, how to measure, how to evaluate the success of the transparency initiative strategies. And this is quite really hard for us to have some sort of 100% transparency. And in my opinion, it should be kind of really selective. And my second question is that on the South China Morning Post, the National Security Advisor of the Philippines mentioned that the Philippines is planning a long-term strategies in the post-Marcos administration to force a more consistent approach to safeguard the Philippines' interests. So could you please elaborate on these issues? Thank you.
Patrick.
Hi, my name is Patrick. I'm a journalist from Switzerland, but I'm based in Taiwan. And I would quickly like to raise a problem I observe in Taiwan when it comes to fighting for Chinese interference. Taiwanese society is heavily polarized, pro-China, anti-China. And obviously it's the China critical side who pushes for laws against Chinese interference. And it's often people on the pro-China side who are being caught up in these laws. So actually these divisions are being amplified with the fight against Chinese influence. And I think maybe for Singapore and Malaysia, how do you deal with this, that you actually don't make the problem worse, because these divisions can be exploited by a power like China?
Prashant?
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to echo some of the sentiments that were made across the panelists about performance and making sure that we're clear about the indicators that we're talking about. So on the transparency initiative, I totally agree that if you're expecting metrics that are extremely high or sort of falsely inflated, like changing China's behavior, which, let's face it, even bigger countries like the United States have not been able to do that in the South China Sea. That's a really unfair metric. And so I think more transparency on the metrics that are being used to measure the transparency initiative and what those metrics are is extremely helpful. I would say two other points. One is resourcing, which Tricia flagged. You know, I do think that some of the Chinese state-owned media, they do get away with a lot because they cover events that not a lot of other media outlets cover. Even if you look at some of the ASEAN events and sub-regional events, the BIMP, EAGA, for example, Xinhua does a much better job covering it than a lot of, very sadly, Southeast Asian media outlets. And so I do think we need a broader conversation about the media ecosystems in each of these countries and across the region on how we can do that. It doesn't have to be a government-supported model, but how do we think about financing? And that's something which Australia, Canada, a number of countries are thinking about. Google and the sort of the decimation of the local media ecosystem, and how do you talk to companies about how they engage in that space as well. So I think that's one aspect, and the final one I'll just mention real quick is how do we think about aligning transparency? We're talking about this in a very specific context, South China Sea and the maritime domain. But one area where you actually see a lot of cross-regional cooperation is transparency on the scam networks, the illicit scam networks across the region. And so I think if we broaden the aperture of transparency to look at these other areas too, we might be able to find ways, not for governments, but for non-state actors. What we've talked about, Colin mentioned academic communities, civil society. So we can start at different points and bring ourselves together even if we're divided on individual issues there.
Justin?
Thank you. Good morning. My question is for ADG Malaya. So What are the concrete lines of efforts by the Marcos administration as it in the next 3 years with regards to foreign interference in local politics in the Philippines, particularly as it relates to the eventual institutional capture of the government because foreign actors would sponsor local politicians who would eventually become important national politicians? The example of the Alice Guo case comes to mind. She is a foreign national. She was able to infiltrate Philippine elections and win as a mayor. Secondly, she was able to run a campaign funded and supported by the Chinese Philippine offshore gaming operators. So basically, the illicit Chinese dark money is also interfering with our elections. And then thirdly, the ability of presidents to appoint presidential advisors who are not Filipino nationals. This is very notorious with the case of Yang with the previous administration. And then fourthly, the grant of citizenship as well to some of these foreign nationals who just so happen to contribute money to the economy, and then the senators would grant them citizenship, which thankfully the current administration right now vetoed in one recent case. So what's the blueprint for the Marcos administration to address these very tangible issues?
Thank you for that. Again, apologies to the rest, to Marites, Titina, and Suleiman, and the rest. Maybe we can continue this discussion later on. It looks like the less time we have, the more questions you got. I mean, this is the thing with putting academics inside one room, for heaven's sake. 30 seconds, maybe each of you, except ADG Malay, because there's a very blueprint question. Maybe you can send your PowerPoint to Justin later on. You want closing statements? Yeah, probably, yeah.
Okay, I'll respond to just that question on whether divisions can be exploited by China. Of course, they can. Both Malaysia and Singapore have deeply polarized societies, which we've done a lot of work to try and build resilience around. So I think resilience is a good word that we need to think about in response to disinformation as well. What happens in a future in which these divisions continue to be exploited? I think we can look to examples like Romania, where we know the Russian disinformation campaign there directly led to the election outcomes previously. So building resilience, I think, is the ideal closure that we need, civil society, legal, and all the various stakeholders. Thank you.
Well, I'd just like to respond to the question of Prashant about media ecosystem. The Philippines, we have embedded a lot of journalists coming from Australia, Japan, even Germany, Taiwan, and some of the European countries. Some are asking, like, why is it the Philippines are not bringing on board Southeast Asian journalists? Well, as what Tricia can attest, we reached out to my network to Southeast Asian academic, Indonesians, Malaysians, and even Vietnamese. They gave me the contact details. We even sent them emails that, we will shoulder your airfare, hotel accommodation, and make sure that you will be on board the Coast Guard vessel to document the Chinese aggression in the West Philippine Sea. Nobody of all the Southeast Asian media personalities ever responded to our email, even if we told them that we are going to shoulder all their expenses. So I don't know what is the complete reason behind all this, but that is how I would like to describe the media ecosystem when it comes to Southeast Asia and comparing it with European countries and like-minded states. These countries outside the region are more supportive in documenting and exposing Chinese aggression compared to our own.
Let me just react quickly. Not necessarily. Media from Singapore are always here. Yes.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Singapore.
Singapore,
I
CNA.
always forget Singapore is,
CNA, they do documentaries.
Singapore is
In,
Southeast Asia.
in fact, I was in a public place in Singapore. I was looking at the coverage from CNA. And there are several, I just forget right now, but there are some news outlets that do coverage of these issues. As to the question about the blueprint for the Marcos administration, we are still learning about these things. No? The Philippine security establishment has always been focused with internal security operations for so long, for 50 years in fact, that we are now just opening our eyes to the threat of foreign malign influence and interference. No? We are still at a stage where we're developing our cybersecurity operations, developing our counterintelligence operations. But as you can see, it has borne fruit. The continued, the arrests, the series of arrests that we've done of Chinese agents in the Philippines, and our vigorous attempts to address foreign malign influence, I think shows that we are serious about working on this. That's why we are working very closely with Congress, that they will soon pass the Foreign Interference and Malign Influence Act. We do recognize that there are more, that this is just the tip of the iceberg. But you know, when you go out into the public and you file cases, you need strong evidence, no? Because we do not want to be accused by the PRC of creating xenophobia, right? Of creating racial tensions within the Philippines. So we want to make sure that when we accuse someone of being paid by the PRC, we do have the evidence at hand. Now, the case of Alice Guo is not necessarily about Chinese state influence. No? There has never been any evidence that Alice Guo is an MSS spy or a spy of the PRC or an agent of China. It is true that she is part of a criminal syndicate, so it could be a Chinese criminal syndicate, no? But it has never been established that she's state-sponsored, no? So these things take time, no? As I said, the Philippine government is still in the process of increasing our capacity for resilience and creating the policies and systems that will make us address all of these issues. But definitely, given that the can of worms has been opened, it is now our responsibility to address this vigorously.
And to our resident one-man troll farm, Ian, you definitely can do something. Any closing statements? Yes, please.
Yeah, so I guess very quickly, I think media resourcing is an important thing to do. And I think in our region, that's something we can probably do a little bit more. And getting back to my earlier point about being even-handed, we do and should look at some of these, if we have public broadcasters, the sort of charters for them to be independent. We see this in Australia with ABC, with SBS, Canada with CBC, of course, most famously in the UK with BBC. They're a very trusted source because they have that independence. And if we want to get our narratives out in a trusted way, that's something we should be thinking about. Polarization, I agree, is an issue. I mean, Taiwan is a pretty special case because they even themselves, are restricted from talking more about what their policy ought to be. However, I do want to say that the Taiwan case is also instructive. Yes, the people who are pro-China will complain a lot, but the way that they complain is quite interesting. They aren't complaining anymore about, well, we want to be pro-China. Can we be more pro-China? It's about, oh, we're being persecuted, right? So, and rule of law is not being adhered to. So in that sense, the conversation has already shifted with some of the ways that the narrative is. It takes some time, but it's slowly getting there. Now, this also brings me to the point I think that Prashant made about having proper metrics. I agree that for the Philippines, it's about building, get awareness such that their friends, their allies, and also their own population can understand what's at stake. That goes with my point about getting public education going. But on the change of the PRC behavior side, it's done one change, right? Think about the period from maybe 2012 to about 2016. Boats were getting rammed, they were getting sunk, crews were being detained, boats were being detained. We see far less of that now. I think one of the benefits of the transparency initiative, because everybody can see what's going on, there's been, yes, it's still very rough, but there has been a slight calibration in how rough the PRC wants to be, how they want to be seen publicly. So there is some benefit. It's not a silver bullet and solve everything, but there is some progress.
On that note, thank you very much. Maybe a round of applause to our great panel here. Thank you so much for that. Just to be clear, I was not supposed to be the chair here, so if anything went wrong, it's not my fault. I just filled in for that. But I hope that has awakened everyone, and looking forward to the next panels for this day. Thank you so much, everyone, again. Thank you, Ian. That was
Once
fantastic.
again, let's give them a round of applause.
Let's do more of that.
All right. Apologies for the delay, but you have at least 3 to 5 minutes before we proceed to our next panel. But before that, may I call on the next panel. Chairing the session is Professor Renato Cruz de Castro, Distinguished Professor from De La Salle University, Manila. Panelists include His Excellency Lai Thai Bin, Ambassador of Vietnam to the Philippines, His Excellency Agus Wijojo, Ambassador of Indonesia to the Philippines, Assistant Secretary Marshal Luis Alferez, Assistant Secretary Maritime and Ocean Affairs Office, DFA Philippines, and Vice Admiral Alexander Lopez, retired from Armed Forces